Okay, wonderful. Welcome and good evening. My name is Hillary. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Transit Museum. Thank you for joining our program to celebrate Grand Central Madison's inaugural year. The new station officially opened a year ago today to much fanfare. We'll get started in just a minute, but first we do invite you all to join us at the Transit Museum. It's a really unique and special space located in a decommissioned I&D subway station in downtown Brooklyn. We're currently open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also have a gallery and store in Grand Central Terminal. And our holiday train is actually currently running and still running through February. And you can go and also visit the beautiful murals and then hop on a train in New Grand Central Madison. If you'd like to have closed captioning for today's event, you can just go down to the bottom of your screen and select captions. If you don't see that option, then click on the three dots where it says more, and you should have a fuller menu. And just click to say show captions. If you have any questions during the program, you can put them into the chat. We should have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and I'll share those questions then. Now, we are very honored this evening to have Paul Grether joining us. Paul has 20 years of experience in the transit and passenger railroad industry, currently serving as the acting chief of a new MTA agency, the Grand Central Madison Operating Company. He was a key part of the East Side Access operational readiness team that worked across Long Island Railroad and MTA departments to develop and manage the thousands of tasks and regulatory compliance requirements to transition the East Side Access construction site into Long Island Railroad Grand Central Service. Now, before coming to New York, Paul started his transit career at the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, working on streetcar development along with many other roles. And he later directed bus and rail service with the Southwest Ohio Regional Transit Authority. It's a lot of expertise. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. I'll hand the mic over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Hillary. I really appreciate this opportunity that from the Transit Museum to talk about Grand Central Madison, particularly fitting today on the first anniversary of service into GCM. And just wanted to give props and a shout out back to the New York Transit Museum. And just hopefully everyone on the line realizes what an incredible resource the Transit Museum is in New York. It's a world-class transit museum and certainly deserving of everyone's support. I know I'm a member and really enjoy the benefits and participating in everything that the museum has to offer. So let's get started. I'm going to talk primarily about the startup process, so everything leading up to the date 1 year ago today that we carried the first, Long Island Railroad carried the first revenue customers into Grand Central Madison, and just talk a little bit about what that process looks like. A lot of what it took to open Grand Central Madison and the process that you go through in order to open a new passenger railroad in the United States is very similar to what a small streetcar system would go through, everything up through something as big as the largest public works project in the United States. So it's interesting to see the similarities. That's been very rewarding for me in my career, and then just to understand the scale, the different scale that it took to open something like this. You know, the process is the same, the numbers are very different, much bigger. So I'm going to refer, so at the beginning, you know, and you may see this in some of the slides, the references to East Side Access. You know, we've retired the term East Side Access. That was really a planning and engineering term. And this is now Long Island Railroad service to Grand Central. So I'm going to not dwell on it very long, but just to kind of give a little bit of an overview, since I know we have folks participating from all over the country and even internationally. So what is Long Island Railroad service to Grand Central? What was East Side Access? Why was it built? And why was it so important? So this diagram shows, in the yellow lines you see here are the existing Long Island Railroad lines. Traditionally, Long Island Railroad service, coming from Jamaica, the majority of the trains come down the main line. You see here the Port Washington branch of the Long Island Railroad going through what's called Herald Interlocking. I'll briefly talk about that. And the traditional western terminus of Manhattan is Pennsylvania Station, which opened back in 1910. And up until a year ago today was the primary, actually the only Manhattan terminal that the Long Island Railroad had, in recent times. So Penn Station has capacity issues. Additionally, a lot of the new employment and new development in Manhattan was occurring on the eastern side of Midtown Manhattan. So there's a need to accommodate and drive really new Long Island Railroad ridership. To do that, you need capacity. There's a desire to access all that development in East Midtown. There's a desire to reduce the travel times of Long Island Railroad customers. And then also very important, you see these East River tunnels here. There was damage to those tunnels that was done during Hurricane Sandy. There's repairs that need to be made. It's good to have resiliency, not just for those when the times when repairs are being done to the tunnels, but also to have resiliency for the Long Island Railroad to have its own access to Manhattan that's not dependent on any other railroad. So basically from Herald Interlocking into Penn Station is Amtrak territory, and through longstanding agreements, Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, and Long Island Railroad share these tunnels and share these tracks. So the service to Grand Central provides an exclusive terminal, exclusive under river tunnels, and exclusive station for Long Island Railroad, which is important for resiliency purposes. So the history of the service to Grand Central Madison goes back really to the early MTA days, even when the MTA used to be called the MCTA, the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Authority. Shortly after the state of New York, through the MCTA, acquired the Long Island Railroad from the Pennsylvania Railroad, thoughts began about how to increase capacity to Manhattan. Plans were implemented, and coincidentally, the Transit Authority was looking at how to increase subway capacity between Manhattan and Queens. And so there was a joint Long Island Railroad, New York City Transit project developed to construct what became known as the 63rd Street Tunnel. So this was conceived in the 60s, largely built in the 70s. If you go on the MTA's YouTube channel, I think the Transit Museum has uploaded some early documentaries from that time that document the construction. Very, very interesting. I won't dwell on it here, but I think the key takeaway of the 63rd Street Tunnel is that it was a double-deck tunnel. So this was built. The upper level was always intended for New York City Transit subway trains, and then the lower level was intended for Long Island Railroad service in the future to the east side of Manhattan. In 1989, the New York City Transit Service started in conjunction with construction that was done in Queens to connect the F train. And then until a year ago, the lower level of the tunnel was vacant. And then some updates were made as part of the project construction and now sees regular Long Island Railroad service. So that is really, those tunnels were really the key that unlocked the whole project. So again, I'm going to give three diagrams here that I think give a nice overview of what the infrastructure looks like. Really, the project has three components. Over here, you'll see Grand Central Madison. This is the station that's largely underneath Grand Central Terminal. This was mined out from through the Manhattan bedrock. There's some tail tracks, but then the next piece of infrastructure is the tunnels that were built. These are new tunnels constructed to connect to the 63rd Street Tunnel going underneath Roosevelt Island in the East River, connecting to another set of new tunnels built underneath Queens to Herald Interlocking that I showed, which is basically the junction of Amtrak, Long Island Railroad in Queens. Another part that's not shown on this diagram, but the other third component of the project was to construct what's called Midday Storage Yard. And that's really located here. It's a parking lot for trains that in between the rush hours on weekdays. So similar to the West Side Yard for Penn Station, Long Island Railroad, the Midday Storage Yard serves as an important part of what makes service to Grand Central possible. So this gives you more of like a map view, a plan view of everything. So you'll see Grand Central here, Grand Central Madison, the tail tracks where 4 trains could be stored, then the tracks in the new tunnels connecting to the 63rd Street Tunnel into Queens under the East River, then the connections to Herald. This also shows the Midday Storage Yard. And what's important to note is that there are 4 tracks, tunnels that come out of Queens. 3 of them connect to the Long Island Railroad main line and to the Port Washington branch. And then a 4th tunnel is what we call Tunnel LL that loops around and allows us to access that midday storage yard without interfering with service, Amtrak service, or other Long Island Railroad trains within Herald Interlocking. Just a view of Grand Central Madison. It's a two-layer station. This is the upper, what we call concourse level. This is located in the former Metro North, former Grand Central Terminal Madison Yard. So this used to be midday storage of trains for Metro North. An early project was to build the new Highbridge Yard in the Bronx so that Metro North trains could be relocated out of this area. And the facility was converted into a passenger concourse. So this is where ticketing, future retail, all of the kind of concourse level station functions, the various entrances, provisions for entrances. You'll see when you walk in on the concourse level at the southern end of the station near 43rd Street, the walls start to curve, and that's a reflection of its former function as a rail yard. It used to connect into what was called the lower level loop track of Grand Central Terminal. So the geometry of the concourse very much follows the rail yard that it replaced, which is just an interesting historical note when you're walking in the concourse. The key that makes the Grand Central Madison station work is the caverns. There are two caverns that were mined out deep underneath Grand Central, underneath Park Avenue. And the reason for going deep is to go underneath everything else and to avoid interrupting, what is arguably the world's economic center in Manhattan. So there was no tolerance for service disruption, and that's why this was all mined out. No disruption of any of the activities on the surface. And then there's 4 very long escalator wellways that connect these caverns to the concourse. For those of you that have used the station, they're very impressive high-speed escalators that connect into the 2 caverns. Each cavern has 2 floors of platforms. There's an island upper and a lower island platform. So with 2 tracks on each island platform, that gives us 8 total station tracks. And an interesting historical note is, the Grand Central Terminal's track numbers, the single-digit tracks were always the long-distance trains at the upper level. The 100 series tracks on the lower level were the express or commuter trains. So we continue that tradition with the 200 and 300 level tracks. So really Grand Central operates as one transportation campus. And then this is what the territory looks like from an operations point of view. This is your track diagram. So you see your connections to Herald Interlocking, your track to the yard, the various interlockings that interconnect the 2 tracks that go underneath the East River, and then breaking up through various interlockings into the 8 platform station tracks. And then we have 4 tail tracks for storing trains leading up into the PM rush hour. So just to give an overview, I think it's important to note that we're in a deep tunnel. There's a tremendous amount of systems, and those systems all have to transition from construction into operations, traction power, train control systems, computer and building networks, ventilation. So not just ventilation in terms of keeping the station at the right temperature, but very importantly, tunnel ventilation, which is an important safety element when you're in a deep tunnel, especially one that is built to modern codes. The train signal system and central traffic control system, all the fire life safety systems like fire alarms, smoke extraction system, sprinkler systems, radio communications, not only for the trains, but first responders and other operations and maintenance personnel, systems that integrate all of this, such as building management systems, security systems. All of these systems are interconnected on a modern computer network. So just to give you an idea of what some of that looks like and what some of that looked like during constructions, you may ride the train into East Side Access or into Grand Central Madison and not realize just the huge amount of infrastructure that is supporting that all had to be built. And importantly, for operational startup, had to be tested and commissioned, deemed to be safe, and deemed to be operationally ready. So when the railroad is started up, it's not a solo exercise. This railroad startup, even though this is exclusively Long Island Railroad track, had to be coordinated through a series of stakeholders From a regulatory point of view, both the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Railroad Administration, both part of the US DOT, are involved. And we'll talk a little bit about how we as a railroad work with these organizations to start up the new railroad and what that involved. Even within the MTA, there's Metro North and Long Island Railroad that played major roles. Even New York City Transit, because of the shared tunnel, plays a role. And then Amtrak, because of the connection at Harold Interlocking, and because East Side Access trains share a positive train control system. There was substantial coordination with Amtrak, shared dispatching from Penn Station controls, Harold Interlocking. So all these stakeholders were heavily involved in the startup. So how do you go about developing the plan for starting up a passenger railroad? Within kind of the lingo of rail operations, this is called rail activation, activating the railroad. So first, you have to have an organizational structure within the entity responsible for operations. So construction of Grand Central Madison, the tunnels, the station, the yard, was all handled by MTA Construction and Development. This is an MTA agency specifically charged with implementing the MTA's mega projects and capital program. So they are not the operating agency. Long Island Railroad is the operating agency. So that's where the handshake begins. MTA C&D is managing the construction contracts, and Long Island Railroad is managing, the hiring of its own staff, the training of its own staff, and all of the elements that go into starting up a railroad. So to achieve what we call operational readiness, or OPR, we develop a rail activation plan, or the RAP, as we called it. That's kind of, now you're in with us now. There's inside baseball, right? So this is a federally required document. So any even small rail systems, large rail systems that are new, that are starting up, will go through a rail activation planning process. And it's really kind of a project management exercise. So you think about all the thousands of tasks that have to be accomplished. All those get put on a piece of paper. They're put into a schedule. They're put into a project management monitoring system, and then divided into categories. And what we implemented was a rail activation committee that kind of sat at the top, where the department heads throughout the railroad participated on this committee. And then there were sub-task groups for all the responsible entities. So if you think about what is required, we had our first task group is operational readiness. That was our operational readiness group. The second group, train service, this is transportation. So these are the folks who operate the trains, are the conductors and locomotive engineers, the folks dispatching, so block operators, supervisory personnel, the folks that are going to be responsible for writing amendments to the Long Island Railroad Book of Operating Rules, the folks that are going to be responsible for the hiring and to some extent the training of all the personnel that are going to be operating in this system, and governing all of the train movements, and then governing the territory. The second task group, infrastructure, this is really the engineering department within Long Island Railroad, and then others. Metro North has some maintenance responsibility, and other organizations. So this task group, is really responsible for the takeover of all of the assets. So the transition from construction contracts and construction contractors that control assets, and then having trained workforces that have participated in contractor training, have signed off that the systems meet all of the requirements of Long Island Railroad prior to assuming responsibility for those. So you could think of things like the signal system, the track system, the traction power system. All of these fell into task group 3. Asset management, there's tens of thousands of assets that are created within East Side Access. You think about escalators, signal systems, lighting systems, track systems, right? Tunnels. All of these assets have to be documented, put into a database. All the information about those assets, such as its installation date, manufacturer, any warranties, any maintenance manuals, all of those all that information has to be captured and put into the MTA's asset management system. So it's a significant administrative task that is critical for the successful operations and maintenance. We put in here Grand Central. This is the stations group. So making sure that from a customer service point of view, the Long Island Railroad ticketing system is ready to print tickets to Grand Central, that we have staff that are trained and ready to handle the customers. that we have staff that are ready to keep Grand Central clean. Staffing and training. So this is the human resources function as well as the training function. Significant hiring that has to occur to accommodate the additional trains, all the Long Island Railroad staff that are required, and they all have to be trained. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of that training entails. Safety and security, I'll detail this later, but the group that's responsible for making sure that we safety certify, that we comply with all the regulatory requirements, and at the end of the day, can sign on the dotted line that the system is safe and secure and ready to carry revenue passengers. Public information and marketing, getting the information out ahead of time to Long Island Railroad customers to make sure they're not just aware of the new schedules, but also know how to use the new Grand Central Madison facility. Agreements, there's lots of kind of behind the scenes legal agreements with outside organizations, as well as internal procedures between the MTA organizations that have to be developed and conformed before you can open. Finance, this is budget, making sure, particularly from an operational readiness point of view, that the operating budget within the MTA is ready to absorb all of the new services. And then finally, fleet readiness. This is not just making sure that we have the trains available, but things like making sure all of the trains that will serve East Side Access have the new positive train control package required that operate into the terminal. The new midday storage yard is ready and staffed and equipped to handle the maintenance that's going to occur on trains at that new location for Long Island Railroad. So a lot of activities. I think that kind of gives you a flavor that all have to be captured into this process. So how do the meat and potatoes of operational readiness kicks off once you're able to bring trains into the tunnel? What is the first thing you have to do? Make sure the trains fit in the tunnel. So the very first, what we call integrated test, and that's now we're testing with trains, right? We're testing the infrastructure integrated with trains, no longer kind of the static testing of individual assets. So the very first tests that were conducted, and I've got a few photos here I'll show, are the clearance tests. So in the tunnel territory, this is obviously very important, and we test not just to see does the train fit, we want to test to make sure that the train fits at the various speeds it's going to be operating with. We test in an emergency to make sure even if a train has, say, a failed suspension, that it's still going to clear all of the infrastructure. So you see on this M7 here, the foam cutouts that have been placed on the train. This represents the dynamic envelope of the train. So if the train is traveling at a certain one rate of speed, the suspension may lean a certain way. If it's traveling at a lower speed, it may lean a different way. And so as a result, you have to take that into account when you're doing the clearance testing. So you can see the foam is painted red. That's really as this train is moved through the new territory, that if it hits or makes contact with anything, it'll intentionally scrape that paint, and then that clearance item can be addressed. And you can see on this train that it's being measured not just on the end of the car, in the middle of the car, and the other end of a car to take into account the dynamics of the train moving through the territory. So this just gives you an idea of what those clearance tests look like. Another important test is clearance at the platforms and at the door thresholds. So the vehicle platform interface is conducted in the tunnel. So this foam here is removable. This is the clearance within the tunnel. And then there's a separate foam that's placed on the trains to check the interface with the platforms. And we'll see that here in a little bit. This just gives you some flavors of what that looked like. Here's the end of the train with the clearance foam applied. Then this is the platform interface test, testing the very narrow tolerances that are required. These have to be very precise. Because Grand Central Madison is a new station, it must fully comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and ADA has very prescriptive elements for the interface between the train and the platform. So these are very carefully checked as part of the integrated testing. So what's next? After we have verified that the train fits in the tunnel, which we did, testing went very well. The next step is to start testing the other systems. So for that, you need passengers, right? And we can't test with 1,000 passengers each time we want to test a train. So instead, we have sandbags that fill in for passengers. And the reason we load the weight onto the trains is so that the train behaves as if it's fully loaded. That's its maximum case. That's where it's drawing the most electricity. That's where its braking distances and acceleration rates are at the kind of the ends of the envelopes. So that's where we want to test to make sure that all the systems behave correctly. So using a loaded train, so a lot of sandbags. Remember, Grand Central Madison is designed for 12-car trains. So imagine hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these sandbags are loaded into the test train. And then we use that test train to test the traction power system to make sure that with multiple loaded trains starting at the same time, that the traction power system is able to deliver the 750 volts DC at the high levels of current required to move fully loaded 12-car trains. We test the signaling system to make sure that the braking distances, the acceleration rates of the trains match what was designed and what was built in the signal system, and just test all the elements of the infrastructure to support that. So this just gives you, this is obviously accelerated, but this was our first fully loaded high-speed test in the territory. So this was kind of a breakthrough moment where we were able to use the signaling system and able to operate a train for the first time at maximum authorized speed within the territory, which is 65 miles an hour. So that was sped up, but just gives you an idea of what it looked like in the control center when we successfully passed that test. So once the integrated testing is complete, the next kind of major activity is to train the train crews. So if you think about a railroad, the folks that drive the train, it's very different driving a train than it is, say, driving an automobile, in the sense that when you drive an automobile, you can drive on a street that you've never driven on before. And through the clues that you get from the road signs and traffic signals and other things, you can safely drive on a street that you've never driven on before. Railroads are very different. Railroads are treated, you're qualified, not just on the book of rules, not just on the how you operate the equipment, but specifically on the territory. So a locomotive engineer, a conductor, other qualified personnel, such as dispatching personnel, have to know the railroad by heart. They have to memorize the location of all the signals. They have to have what's called physical characteristics familiarity with the entire territory, down to tiny little details, so that they know where they can and can't accelerate, what speeds they can operate at, the behavior of the signaling system, the different routes, so that they can safely operate at the correct speed and interpret signal aspects. Very, very, very important. So there are federal requirements for this, in addition to Long Island Railroad requirements. So we have to get all of the personnel trained. So how do we do that? Particularly while construction is still going on, and we'll talk a little bit about how that was done. There were over 2,000 qualified personnel on Long Island Railroad that we had to move through a training class. And you think about physical characteristics training, you think about if you've seen a Long Island Railroad train, there's only room for so many people at the front of the train, right, to look out the window. And so there were a lot of things done that we did to conduct the training safely, primarily, and then efficiently to get all of the Long Island Railroad personnel trained on the new territory. So I do have one video that I'm going to show that will kind of explain this. So hopefully the video plays. There we go.
I'm a locomotive engineer training specialist. My job is to train new locomotive engineer trainees, as well as a project such as this. We train already qualified locomotive engineers on the new territory. My job is to help them learn the physical characteristics of the railroad, such as where our signals are, the station platforms, speed restrictions, all of that stuff, as well as our book of rules to operate a train safely. The new tracks that we have going into Grand Central, it's only Long Island Railroad operating on these tracks, which is excellent. It really is impressive how much they fit underground, and I don't think I expected it to be as intricate as it is.
It's definitely different than what we've ever done before. So we had to do a video training, and so that way they can see the head-end movement live as the train is moving. Never done that before, never felt the need, but for this one, we actually did feel that it was necessary for them to see it, to understand what was going on with the tracks, It's a learning curve for both the engineers and the conductors.
You're learning about the tracks, what tracks lead to what platforms. You're learning about the yard. You're learning about speeds. Grand Central has so much history that, going into that new terminal and it being so airy and it's spacious, it's going to be fun.
It's a different environment. It's new physical characteristics that, we get to operate over. And what's not exciting about operating over a new portion of railroad?
All right. So that's how the training is conducted. So we'll talk a little bit about how, from a regulatory and safety point of view, we're able to get essentially permission to open and are able from the MTA and from Long Island Railroad and MTA C&D's perspective, self-certify that we believe the system is safe and secure. And there's a process that we go through for that. And that was very much linked to how we opened the system, conducted the training while construction was still wrapping up and construction activities were still very much active. So the two agencies I mentioned at the beginning, the Federal Transit Administration, very process-driven organization. They have a lot of document requirements. So, I talked a little bit about the system integrated testing that's governed by a comprehensive system test plan that MTA C&D developed, that Long Island Railroad participated in. On the safety and security side, I won't go through these, but there's a whole host of plans and procedures that are required specific to the project that you have to submit to the FTA. And then importantly, at the bottom, they have requirements for what are called pre-revenue operations. And this is an attempt to simulate the service so that all of your folks are trained, that you are able to stress the infrastructure and determine any operational hiccups, particularly as it relates to the infrastructure, but also just in terms of your procedures and other things before you're carrying customers. And so I'll talk a little bit about in a minute how we conducted pre-revenue operations. There's a whole series of operating documents that the FTA requires: a fleet management plan update, updates to your book of rules I talked about earlier, procedures, everything I mentioned about the contents of the rail activation plan, not surprisingly, are also linked to the requirements that FTA has. So these are all things that we submit and that they oversee to ensure that we're meeting all of our schedule milestones. And then finally, the FTA has what's called a safety and security certification. This is essentially a self-certification process that they oversee, where through, I won't get into the details, but a very, very detailed process, you make sure that all of the safety elements are traced through from the design of the infrastructure, through the construction, through the testing, and then ultimately through the operations. Very, very intensive process, but one that is extremely worthwhile and needed to make sure that everything is safe and secure. Finally, as a railroad, unlike, say, New York City Transit, both Metro North and Long Island Railroad are governed by the Federal Railroad Administration. This is kind of the railroad equivalent of the FAA. And so the FRA has very specific legal requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations that they are required to do to ensure the safety of rail transportation. So we were designated by FRA as a line extension. That's very important because Long Island Railroad, unlike, say, a brand new passenger railroad that's being built somewhere that's starting a new commuter rail line or a new intercity line, as a line extension, you carry with you everything that Long Island Railroad already has. So Long Island Railroad has approved plans. There's hundreds of requirements that FRA has for approved plans. Those are all submitted and approved. That doesn't mean that you don't have to update what you have to cover the new territory. This is significant tunnel territory. There's other characteristics unique to Grand Central Madison, but all of that has to be, as a designated line extension, we were able to leverage everything that Long Island Railroad already had. Basically, the FRA takes on their oversight the first time a train wheel touches the rails. So when we began testing, when we did that clearance test, that's when they began oversight. I mentioned earlier, we wanted to continue construction in the tunnels while operating test trains. And to make the schedule, that was critical. We needed a year to train operations. And I imagine the public would not have been very patient with us if we said, yep, all the construction's done, but We need a year to do the testing and training. That was not going to fly. And so we worked very closely with the FRA to develop a scheme to ensure that we could safely operate the test trains, but continue operations for training. So that was done two ways. During the testing period, we actually separated the tracks. So we basically disconnected East Side Access and reconnected East Side Access to Long Island Railroad every day. So we were connected during the times we were operating trains, and we were disconnected during the times we weren't. In order to operate test trains, Long Island Railroad actually leased M7 equipment to MTA Construction and Development. So just to conduct those tests, where you saw those trains that had the foam, or those trains that were conducting the load tests, those were not Long Island Railroad operated trains. Those were still being operated as construction trains. And there was a whole operating organization set up within the construction team to operate the test trains during the times we were disconnected from Long Island Railroad. So in order to do the training, now the Long Island Railroad staff have to operate the trains. So in order to do that, we would, as I mentioned earlier, temporarily connect, operate our training trains, and then disconnect. To do that, a very detailed safety procedure was developed. We had significant oversight from FRA, and every day FRA was checking up both in the field and over the phone to make sure that that process was going well. And we would actually physically walk every inch of track in the tunnels before Long Island Railroad would commence train operations to make sure there were no construction personnel around, to make sure there's no tools or materials left behind, to make sure it was safe to energize the third rail and to operate trains. And so that handoff back and forth during the day, we would train, and at night construction would continue. That was key to making the schedule, and that was key to being safe. Finally, I talked about pre-revenue operations. We did that twice. We did our own pre-revenue operations after we had enough folks trained, where we took almost 10 trains, I think it was 10 trains, and simulated the schedule within the East Side Access territory. And so tried to build up an AM and a PM rush hour. We did that for 2 weekends. We had to do it in the weekend because that's when the trains and crews were available. And then once the PTC, the Positive Train Control Safety System, was in place, the FRA now has new requirements to do what's called a pre-revenue safety validation plan. And so any new railroad has to basically operate like a new railroad. Everything has to be built, everybody has to be trained, all the infrastructure has to be finished, all the personnel have to be in place, as if you're carrying passengers. The only difference is there's no passengers. And so we have to successfully operate what they call a period of simulated service. So we operated for 4 days, operated simulated service, and you cannot have a flaw. So any even minor rule infraction, any infrastructure failure, anything like that disqualifies that period of simulated service. And until you can demonstrate to the FRA that you can operate the railroad safely, and that both the infrastructure and the rules that have been developed all work together, you cannot carry passengers. And so I'm happy to say we passed that process through, and we were one of the very first properties, new territories, to kind of go through this new FRA process. I mentioned all the different plans that are required. I won't go through those, but needless to say, we had a lot of major updates to do, even though we carried over a lot of the hundreds of railroad plans. Finally, both the FTA and the FRA processes require, from a safety point of view, that you coordinate with first responders, and that you have, on the FRA side, it's your Part 239 passenger train emergency procedures, and on the FTA side, for your safety and security certification, that you conduct live exercises. And so this is really a simulation of an emergency within the territory, and making sure that both the railroad and the first responders all have the procedures necessary, and any tweaks that need to be made. So we conducted a tunnel emergency evacuation exercise. We staged a simulated stalled train in the tunnel, and conducted an evacuation. So we worked with the MTA Police ESU unit, of course, the FDNY, the Fire Department in New York, as well as the MTA Police and other first responders to do this exercise. So I'll just show you what that looked like. We had actually had multiple volunteer victims, and each victim gets a triage card from the FDNY. And so this is really where your Oscar-winning performances come in. You know, you have to have folks that are panicked. You have to have folks that are injured. You have to have folks that are freaking out. You have to have folks that are calm. You have to have folks that are disabled. You have to have folks that are elderly, mobility impaired for other reasons. And we had all of those categories covered. And through really the superb cooperation of the first responders, we had a very successful exercise. We learned a lot, and as a result, we're able to amend some of our procedures. So this shows one of the street hatches that goes into East Side Access that was opened up. This is the FDNY responding to the simulated train that is stalled and having a smoke event. So here's the fire department entering the tunnel. This is the MTA Police Department ESU unit. Some of the evaluation staff on the surface. We had evaluation staff everywhere to kind of monitor all the activities and write down notes so that we could learn from this exercise. Our federal regulatory partners also participated in overseeing this. And just, these are some pictures from in the actual rescue train. So you have to remember, we're down, 16, 18 stories below ground at this point. So these folks have just come down a very long stairwell. And then evacuating the remaining passengers. And escorting folks up the stairs. And then the train crew also dialing in using the tunnel emergency telephones to simulate a call. More pictures during the evacuation. And then success. We have smiling victims who have been rescued from the simulated emergency. And then very important, probably the most important part of any live exercise is what's called the hot wash. And the whole team, all the victims, all of the different departments involved, the first responders, everybody gathers and does a debrief immediately while all the information is fresh. We all take notes. And then at the conclusion of these live exercises is a series of what are called corrective actions that are documented. And anything we learn, whether we have to change procedures, if there's changes to the infrastructure, that's all documented and then put on action item lists to get implemented before we open. Also, from the maintenance point of view, this tunnel territory is very new in terms of Long Island Railroad. It's unique. And so we also conducted a maintenance exercise just to get some of the Long Island Railroad engineering forces accustomed to working in this environment with their equipment. So we simulated welding a piece of rail before we opened, just so that, again, when the call comes to repair something, it's not the first time, right? So just some images from the track maintenance exercise. And then finally, from a customer service point of view, we did the same thing. This is not as critical for safety and security, but more for customer service. And we brought in a large group of volunteers, brought them in on a train, and gave them very specific instructions about where to go. You got off the train, you need a taxi. You got off the train, you need to get to the subway. You got off the train, you're trying to get to the One Vanderbilt building. And for them to test our signage, test the station's employees, ask for directions, generally act lost. And all of the feedback that we received was then incorporated into changes that were made in the station. So this just gives you a view of that wayfinding exercise. So then finally, the day came a year ago today that the first train came into Grand Central Madison. And I just really enjoy this photograph of Penn Station back in 1910. I imagine that the folks in that picture probably went through some similar things that we did. And then the same thing at Grand Central Madison. And then just some pictures of, for those who aren't as familiar with Grand Central Madison, who are dialed in here from around the world, what it looks like today. So in conclusion, just some fun facts from our last year of operations. We've had over 10.5 million passengers in 2023. We were open for 11 months. We are now reaching days where our share of Long Island Railroad traffic to Manhattan between Penn and Grand Central Madison is now reaching 40%. Ridership at Grand Central Madison has consistently been going up since we opened. If we were to take the ridership just going in and out of Grand Central Madison and line it up against all of the commuter rail systems in the United States, just the station alone would be the 6th largest commuter rail system in the US, just with 11 months of operations, compared to a year of operations of other systems or ridership counts. And this is a fun fact. When I was playing around with the spreadsheet, if you were to put up the total of United States commuter rail ridership and look at the share that Grand Central Madison had just for the 11 months it was open, 1 in every 25 US commuter rail passengers passed through GCM in the 11 months we were open in 2023. And then finally, this is a New York Transit Museum presentation after all, so we have to include historical facts. Grand Central Madison is the largest passenger railroad station open in the US. Since the New York Central Railroad, who also coincidentally built Grand Central Terminal, opened their Central Union Terminal in Toledo, Ohio in 1950. And that station is still served by Amtrak today. So finally, in closing, I just want to say, there was a lot of information here. You could tell there was a tremendous amount of work done to open Grand Central Madison on time and to open it safely. There was a huge team that was involved. I was very privileged to be a part of it, played a small role, that just be aware that this reflects thousands of construction workers' efforts, thousands of railroad workers' efforts, and a special shout out to the former Long Island Railroad operational readiness team, if any of them are listening. That was all coordinated through that group, and I was privileged to be a part of it. So with that, Hillary, I'll turn it back over to you to see if there's any questions that I can answer.
Wow, that was fantastic. It's just so amazing to see the incredible scale of this project and how many pieces you had to coordinate fitting together. I think it's really hard to kind of put your head around it until you kind of see it laid out like this. So thank you so much. So yeah, we have a few questions that have come up in the chat, and I'm happy to relay those. If anybody has more questions, feel free to throw those in there. One was right here. It looks like so much work went into the smooth opening. What were the biggest surprises and challenges around opening? Anything that you weren't expecting to happen?
That's a good question. I mean, from the point of view when you're in the weeds day to day, I will say on January 25th, you never really know, right? There's always forecasts. You never really know, like, are people actually going to ride this? And just seeing those first crowds, and I will say the most surprising thing, and this is probably a very much a New York City thing, was on that first day standing on the concourse and watching commuters who behaved and looked like and were walking like they had done this for 100 years, walking through that station just like with a mission to get to work that morning, was amazing. And I think that was a nice testament to a lot of the preparatory work that was done ahead of time. But that was a big surprise. We thought we would get bombarded with questions, and we certainly did have a lot of folks with questions, a lot of folks walking around like looking at things, but at the same time, large numbers of commuters that got off that train like they've been doing it their whole lives, and that was pretty amazing.
Well, I think that probably speaks to a lot of this work, kind of figuring out the design and making sure put so many processes in place. Another kind of related question, and maybe you already answered this, but what were some of the existing conditions and hurdles to overcome when you first took this project on back in 2019?
The biggest problem, I shouldn't say problem, the biggest challenge was COVID. And I started on the project, and then 6 months later, the lockdown happened. Rightfully so, the Long Island Railroad at the time refocused on dealing with the COVID pandemic. The folks at MTAC&D, and in particular the construction workers, did an amazing job at actually continuing the construction throughout the pandemic through a whole series of very detailed safety protocols. And that the challenge that left the railroad is that, during the difficult times of the pandemic, a lot of the activities leading up to opening be stopped, and a lot of, let's say, the hiring, a lot of those things that we had on our schedule that were going to happen in 2020 and early 2021 got behind. And so what kind of is probably something you don't see because of generally how efficiently the system opened is behind the scenes. A lot of those groups that I mentioned at the beginning, the rail activation groups, particularly the hiring effort, kicked into high gear. And it's not easy to hire railroad workers, right? You have to have a very specific skill set. There's all kinds of federal requirements, and then training, very significant training, and that was all accelerated in order to meet the date and to play catch up from the pandemic. And I think that's probably the most amazing thing for me about this project is how the MTA, as an organization, all the different players, all the different departments, were able to mobilize and make this happen despite the significant challenge that the pandemic caused us to have in terms of getting operationally ready.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that actually relates to another question that was asked about kind of anticipated ridership levels. I know since the pandemic, a lot of people are working remotely or have different kind of hybrid working situations, and I know that that's changed ridership patterns. Is that changing kind of the expectation for ridership at Grand Central Madison?
I think so. I mean, I'm certainly not a ridership person, but I could say anecdotally, and just what I observe in some of the numbers is for both commuter rails, but definitely for Long Island Railroad, the weekend and off-peak ridership in many cases actually exceeds the pre-pandemic levels. And we're seeing at Grand Central Madison, when I come here on the weekends, we're seeing a lot of ridership. And so I think, not just the access to all of the new and existing East Midtown office space that Grand Central basically connects to, a lot of the other stuff, right, that's around Grand Central Madison that attracts people to make trips either to or from the city, we're now seeing a benefit from this investment for that as well. And so I think Grand Central Madison is well positioned to take advantage of that, not just for the things around Grand Central Madison, but also just as important for folks coming from New York City that want to go out and explore Long Island, right? And or connect from Long Island Railroad to Metro North or vice versa to make longer trips off peak. I think we're starting to see a lot more of that. The new combo ticket that has been implemented that allows transfers between the railroads, we're seeing increasing use of that, and I think a lot of that is happening off peak.
Oh, that's great. Okay. So there's a question about kind of changing station signage that's been added since the station opened a year ago, whether that was kind of an ADA requirement or things that riders are asking for. And I think this kind of connects to another question that somebody said, are there other lessons that have been learned in this kind of first year and any adjustments that you're making to how the system's operating?
From a customer point of view, there are certainly lessons learned in terms of the signage. Folks that may recall, we had a significant amount of temporary signage up in the beginning. We received a lot of feedback in the beginning about signage. We continue to receive some. There's still some significant adjustments that MTA C&D is going to be making to the signage to kind of permanently incorporate a lot of the feedback that was given. I mean, I kind of look at it like you'll hear folks that work on college campuses sometimes talk about, like, don't pave the sidewalks until after the new buildings open on a campus, because you want to see where the students walk before you decide where they should walk, because oftentimes the two aren't the same. And so I think we've had enough of that now. Like we have a good baseline of where we need to make some changes to the signage, and that's going to be implemented in the near term.
Great. I know that there was also some kind of interesting wayfind design. We had read an article about kind of the color schemes that you were using in different locations to indicate cross streets above on the surface level. And that was kind of interesting if there was something new about that kind of design element that you're adding or experimenting in the station.
Sure. So the architects, and it's worth looking at because it's sometimes it's a little subtle, and particularly for the dashing commuter, they may not be paying full attention. But if you look at the 4 escalator wellways, all 4 of them are slightly different colors. They relate back to Long Island colors. And each of at the top on the concourse level, when you get to the top of the escalators, or at the more southern nodes, the cross streets, 44th, 43rd, you'll see those numbers in the terrazzo in those colors. So, and then that repeats down at the mezzanine level. And that was really an attempt, because you're underground, there's no windows, to try to extend that street grid underground, which I think will be more fully utilized once some of the additional entrances open that are owed to the MTA from some of the property developers above. So, that work continues. And as we get, to our 2nd anniversary, 3rd anniversary, folks are going to start seeing additional entrances open. And I think that wayfinding scheme will really come into its own at that point.
Okay, great. I'm excited to see that. I'm really fascinated by wayfinding. So there's been a bunch of questions focused on the 63rd Street tunnel. Concerns about, since it was dormant for so many years, if there were any problems, and questions about kind of the grading, water inundation, whether they couldn't build it to certain kinds of specs because of just the initial construction. Do you have anything to say about kind of repurposing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly I'm not a construction expert or a civil engineer, but the project, a large part of the project was work on the 63rd Street tunnel and preparing it for this. So that included, not just laying track and putting in power systems, but upgrading the emergency exits, particularly work to bring tunnel ventilation up to current codes and requirements for a new system. There's a lot of details that go into that, but there was a significant investment in upgrading that existing tunnel before we opened.
Okay, great. And we're kind of running out of time, so I guess maybe a last question might be, do you have kind of something next on your plate that you're working on, some new exciting and involved project?
For me, the big project now is managing the existing station. Even though we've been open a year, every day we still learn something new about how to operate and maintain the facility. And part of the thing that is so interesting about Grand Central Madison is, even though it is entirely an MTA project, there's still a lot of stakeholders that we work with, because it's the only place Long Island Railroad and Metro North touch, and even New York City Transit to some extent. And so working between, with all the various stakeholders, things like the fact that Metro North provides the Metro North Fire Brigade that provides fire protection for Grand Central Madison, right? That's unique to us. And so, it's the place where everybody has to work together to make the place work. Folks that, or departments or organizations that don't normally work together. And I have to say, up till now, there's a real, I think, kind of camaraderie among all the different groups that work together, and that's really what, in the end of the day, makes it worth it. So we gotta keep doing that.
Well, I mean, it sounds like an incredible success story. So congratulations on this milestone anniversary, and we'll just hope it continues to grow and continue to develop in great ways.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. It was really great having you share this really incredible presentation. Thank you all for coming. And I can't help but give a little shout out. I don't know if fans of the museum noticed our own content manager, Polly Desjardins, was one of those volunteers in the demo. So that was pretty fun to see her show up on screen. So we just want to kind of wrap things up. I want to give a little nod. We hope to see you at the museum. Please come and join us. We're open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can reserve your tickets online. I'll put some links in the chat right now. If you enjoyed the program, feel free to consider making a donation or becoming a member to help keep things going. We also hope you can join us for more upcoming programs, which you can always find on our website. Next month, we will be celebrating the 170th anniversary of Elizabeth Jennings Graham, her brave stand. She's sometimes referred to as the 19th century Rosa Parks. She challenged a racist streetcar policies with a successful court case and helped pave the way for the desegregation of public transit in New York City. So that's going to be on Thursday, February 15th at 2 p.m. Again, the link is in the chat, so please join us. Thank you again. We hope to see you again. Have a great night, everybody.